Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering listener questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman. I've been working with kids and families for more than 3 decades as a preschool teacher, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the owner and operator of Child Anxiety Support, where I help parents of anxious kids. This episode's question is a really good one. It came from a listener who was asking about my own experience as the parent of a child who was anxious. And it was, what do you wish you'd done differently as a parent of an anxious child? So, what do I wish I'd done differently as a parent of an anxious child? This is really a tough question. Or it's not so much a tough question as a deep and heavy question. Now, the thing is about parenting is I don't think you can get through your career as a parent without having some regrets. I think it's just sort of baked into the experience because we love our kids and we want to do a really great job. And so I think it's nearly impossible to get through 18 plus years of parenting without looking back and saying, oh gosh, I wish I had handled that one day differently. I wish I had handled that one crisis differently. I wish I had known then what I know now. But I also don't think it's really helpful to stay in regret, to really beat ourselves up for it. Because, of course, when we know better, we do better. And we're all pretty much doing the best that we can. That said, when I think about this one, there's some obvious ones. Like it took me a while to see the way I was getting stuck in the parenting pitfalls, most specifically in reassurance of getting stuck in the loop of telling my daughter it would be okay and thinking that my reassurance is what she needed to get out of her anxiety. And it was only when I got additional clinical training about anxiety that I realized what I was doing in our family was actually perpetuating my daughter's anxiety. And so my husband and I had to sit down and really figure out how to apply what I was learning clinically into my family life. And it was harder than it looks because even though I knew the thing, there's an emotional pattern that goes with it where it was very easy to find myself trapped back in those patterns of reassurance, of trying to help her avoid, etc. And it would take a minute for my brain to catch up with my heart and to recognize that what I was doing wasn't helping. Which brings me to the bigger overarching kind of what I wish I had done differently. And that starts with my son, who is not an anxious child. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Like many of you, I came to gentle parenting and respectful parenting in response to the way I was raised. And I am not here to criticize my parents. I have a complicated relationship with both of my parents for a variety of reasons I won't get into here. But I do believe that both of my parents, considering their background, considering their history, considering the culture in which they were raised, it makes perfect sense that they made the decisions that they did to parent me and my siblings. And I'm also not speaking for my siblings who may not have the same feelings about it and certainly didn't have the same experience because we are different people. And so different kids have different experiences with the same parents. Back to me, I was an anxious child. I was an intense kid. I was a negative kid. And I can appreciate that I was a hard child to parent, especially in the middle of an outgoing older sister and an outgoing younger brother. And I was a more negative, a more introverted, a more cautious child. And that must have been really difficult for my mom, who was often a single parent because my dad traveled a lot for work, et cetera, et cetera. Which is all to say that I came to my parenting saying, I do not want my children to experience the feelings that I had as a child of being too difficult, of being too much, of feeling misunderstood, of feeling a little emotionally neglected. Again, I'm not talking about my parents' parenting, but more my experience of my parents' parenting. And so I did what a lot of us do, which is I overcompensated because I was so worried that my son never feel that way. I projected a lot of my feelings onto him forgetting he was being raised in a completely different context and so had a completely different experience than I would have. What this amounted to specifically, I'm thinking about the first 3 years of my son's life where I literally never slept through the night because he didn't. He was still waking up at night, and so I was still waking up with him until he was about 3.5 years old. And I was exhausted for 3.5 years. I was exhausted, but I thought it's what I had to do. And I put aside my feelings of exhaustion, and I would even defend it and say, but I don't mind. I don't mind being physically exhausted and emotionally exhausted and mentally exhausted because I want to be there for my child in the way I didn't feel my parents were for me. What I didn't understand were several things that they are going to make sense in the context of anxiety. And one thing was just because my son was waking up at night didn't mean that I also didn't deserve sleep. Like I deserved sleep. The fact that I was struggling and suffering itself was a sign that something needed to change because my suffering mattered. It was part of our relationship. And again, I did not perceive myself as someone who is suffering, but I look back now and go, "Oh my gosh, I was so dang tired. I was so flippin' tired." And so those early days with my son were impacted by my exhaustion. And again, I was like really proud of myself because I was there for him. But it didn't serve him well because also I wasn't asking him to rise to the challenge of not waking up at night. Now, this is not about co-sleeping or family bed or any of that. It was about believing that his waking up required a very specific response from me that I don't think it did. Okay, so T. Barry Brazelton, who is a terrific pediatrician, he wrote some wonderful books, and he talked about touch points. And he said touch points are points in the parent-child relationship where the parent and child get to learn new ways to connect. And I believe that this is very, very true and very apparent in the crises of parenting. So, those 3.5 years where I was trying to figure out how to nighttime parent my child, I was very vulnerable to other people's ideas of how that should look and ignoring my own struggle. I was very involved with an attachment parenting community that was all about really intensive attachment parenting. And now we call that gentle parenting. And the message in that culture, in the specific culture I was participating in, it's not like every single attachment parent person said this, but in the culture I was participating in, which were email lists where we were the for you youngsters, we didn't have Facebook. And so instead of Facebook group, we had email lists. And those email lists, there was sort of a competition for who would give their most to their child, sort of a competition of who is the most exhausted in doing the thing anyway. That was the culture of those lists. Again, not of the individual people necessarily, but of the overarching list. And I really bought into that. And what I realize now is that was a touch point. That was a crisis point where I really needed to figure out how to make my own way as a parent in connection with my son, that the two of us were creating a relationship together. And when I robbed myself of some measure of agency in trying to be the perfect mother for him, I was also robbing him of this chance for us to build this relationship together, which is why I try really hard not to say never do this, always do that, because I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's more about what I needed then was a mentor that would say to me, let's talk about sleep a little more. Let's talk about your level of exhaustion. Let's talk about how it's okay to ask your child to rise to the occasion of a developmental crisis. When I look back, I wish I had understood that my experience as a parent matters as well. That it's not just about my child's experience and it's not just about my experience. It's about both of our experiences and negotiating that in the context of our relationship. So instead of saying it has to be either my son's needs are met or my needs are met, it's about discovering how we can negotiate our needs. in my clinical practice, one of my expertise was in postpartum mood disorders and postpartum adjustment. And in order to serve that population, I went through the certification program that's designed by Postpartum Support International. I completed that training. I also used to give trainings for doulas and midwives and other birth workers, specifically around postpartum mood disorders, because I think that one of the things that we need to do for postpartum parents is to help them figure out who they are as parents and to help them figuring out that how do I take care of myself? How do I take care of this child? How do I negotiate our needs, particularly if I have a high need sensitive child, if I myself am a high need sensitive person? How do we do that? How do we become good parents when we have those kinds of challenges? And particularly, my interest is in those parents who are trying to do things differently than their own parents and who tend to overcompensate for that. Where does this come into play with anxiety? Well, as I said, I worked with postpartum parents, and one of the things we would talk about is setting limits and boundaries for your child is not the same thing as abandonment. Saying to your child, I am not able to attend to this in this particular way right now, or I am asking you to level up by facing your fears or by not screaming and yelling or hurting yourself or other people when you're upset. That is good parenting. It's okay to do. It is not the same thing as emotionally abandoning your child. It can trigger those of us who did feel emotionally neglected. If we had parents who did not listen to us when we were upset, who did not comfort us or even threatened us, I don't know how many of you heard, like I heard, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. It's not the same thing as saying to a loved, respected child in an attuned, respectful, loving relationship to say, I believe you can manage these big feelings in this way. To say to your child, you may not hit your sibling. If you continue to hit and hurt, I will need to remove you from the situation is not the same thing as spanking, as naming, blaming, or shaming. And it is not the same thing as emotional abandonment where a parent like locked a crying child in a room or, like I said things like, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Sometimes our parenting choices will look like they mirror those things. For example, a child who is hurting siblings may need to be removed to their room. It's not the same thing as a punishing parent angrily putting a child in their room to isolate them. Those are very different things. And again, part of it is the way they're done. Like, do we drag that screaming child in and we're yelling at them and telling them how terrible they are versus are we calmly removing them? But also in the context of the relationship. So if the relationship is generally loving and respectful and kind versus a relationship that is neglectful and shaming and blaming and name calling, then those acts have that different context to lean on. If you have a loving, respectful, gentle parenting relationship, you are allowed to lean on that and ask for more in your child. How that looks is very dependent, not just on who you are, but who your child is and the context in which we're asking them of that. I feel like I'm kind of getting in the weeds here. But my point is, what I wish I had done differently as a parent to an anxious child is trust that there is power in me knowing that I am frustrated and tired of this situation. And instead of saying to myself, oh, I'm a terrible parent because I'm getting frustrated with my kid, instead of feeling guilty because I snapped at them after being nagged one too many times about their worries, instead recognizing when I am struggling in my loving relationship, this is an indicator to me that something in the relationship needs to change and not just, I gotta change me. I've got to change me. There's something wrong with me. I am not being a good enough parent because I'm not being patient enough. I am not being willing to suffer enough. My suffering shouldn't matter. Your suffering does matter. Your relationship with your child is the thing that's going to help your child grow. And your relationship with your child is your child and it's you. So, what I wish I had done differently is hear myself, is to honor my frustration, my anger, my impatience. And instead of seeing that as a failure or as faults of mine, that I saw those as tools, as indicators that I needed to do something differently in my parenting, that I needed to do something differently in my parenting relationship, that I needed to look at what I was asking of my child and see, do I need to ask more of them? If I'm so frustrated when they're doing this thing, is that a sign to me that they are ready to grow and they need my help to do that growing? I remember when my son was a toddler and we started having some of those struggles that toddlers have with their parents that kind of strive for independence. I call it the bent banana stage because my son would melt down if the banana was curved the wrong way. You remember this. You've had this too. You've had toddlers. And I'm sure there's been a time where somebody melted down because you pulled down the green cup and they wanted the blue cup. And so they're melting down about that. That is a struggle for independence and control, and it is natural and normal. And when my son and I were struggling that way, and I was really did not know what was wrong and thought, again, it's me. I'm a terrible parent. And then I realized actually what it was is our relationship needed to shift where I needed to be offering more opportunities for independence and asking more, which is as I'm offering this independence, also asking him to show up in a bigger kid kind of way. My frustration with him and his frustration with me was a sign the relationship needed to change. Not that he was a bad kid, not that I was a bad parent, not that we were screwing up, but that things needed to change. When you come to work with me, that is my thinking. Your unhappiness or your worry or your concern about your child's struggle, your child's anxiety is a sign to me that something needs to change. Not that either of you are doing anything wrong, but that what you've been doing just needs to change. Your unhappiness is a sign of it. Your child's struggle is a sign of it. Growing looks like that sometimes. Growing sometimes means we're unhappy enough to look around and say, something's got to give here. So if you are feeling like, I wish I was a better parent, what's wrong with me? Why am I not doing a good enough job? I would love to invite you to consider that it's not you. You're not the bad parent, and it's not your kid either. It's that, oh gosh, something needs to change. You two are ready to grow. The relationship is ready to shift. Your feelings about this, your unhappiness is a tool for you to realize that. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. And I invite you to share your thoughts with me about that. If you have a question you'd like me to answer on the show, you can go to childanxietysupport.com and go to podcast up there in the menu, and you'll be able to submit a question right there. Or if you just want to contact me, maybe set up a time for us to talk, you can do that on the contact page. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next episode.